What's up, everyone? Welcome back to House Groups. Tonight we're starting a new series and we're so excited about it. We're diving into the Old Testament and the book of Jonah. So from now until summer, we'll be going through the book of Jonah. Just a quick announcement and reminder, if you haven't signed up or if your group hasn't talked about it yet, we are going to be serving with SOS. Your group leader should have all the information that they need to tell you about that ministry and what we'll be doing. What it will cost, what it will look like. So group leaders, as soon as this is done, pause this, whatever you need to do if you haven't already, and talk to your group about serving at SOS. You need a minimum of 5 people to sign up, so just 5 of you get together with your group leader and talk about going and serving at SOS. And other than that, just follow us on Instagram, stay up to date. We'll be having a social hopefully at the end of this month, so more information on that will be coming soon. But yeah, so follow us on Instagram. We're jumping into Jonah tonight and serve at SOS, and we will see you soon.
Well, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the house. We're so glad you're here, and we can't wait to start a new series. If this is your first time and somebody suckered you into being here and you didn't know what you were getting into, we're really glad you came. We are a group of college students and 20s in the city of Memphis that love the gospel. And we want to build some community around the gospel. The good news of the gospel, the grace of the gospel, the truth of the gospel that confronts those sinful parts of our lives. We want to build community around that, the finished work of what Jesus has done on our behalf. So we're going to move into a new series tonight. And we are calling this series Jonah because we're going to walk through the book of Jonah verse by verse like we did with Philippians, like we've done with James. And we hope you have a great handle on both of those books if you've been journeying with us. But before we get into Jonah, we wanted to take a week and talk about the Old Testament to give you some kind of handles on not just the Old Testament, but just good interpretation tools in general. Because it can be really difficult as you approach this book. You've probably heard multiple messages or sermons on the same passage, and the preachers were saying different things and all that kind of stuff. And you're like, well, what does it mean then? Can it mean 2 different things? How do I interpret this book? For some of you, as you approach this thing, it may be intimidating. For some of you, as you approach it, it may be highly confusing. And we want to help. We want this group to be a source of some clarity and some help and some wisdom around how to interpret the scriptures. So tonight, what we're going to do is run through just some good interpretation tools. We're going to talk about the nature of the Old Testament and what God was doing there. And then we'll give you a few examples that I'll talk through. And then we're just going to turn it over to you guys in your groups. And we're going to give you some different passages to read through, to look up, and to develop some good interpretation in your groups from the passages that we give you. So let's walk through some good interpretation tools because this is no ordinary book. This is the Bible. It's 66 different books made up of 40 different writers, but there's one author, and the one author is God himself. 2 Timothy 3:16, for all scripture is God-breathed. It's God-inspired. It has his spirit on it. Peter wrote in the New Testament that the writers were carried along by the Holy Spirit and wrote exactly what the Holy Spirit wanted them to write. But God wrote this book, and he wrote it over a period of 1,400 years. It's a huge time span, different authors, different genres. We're going to talk about genre tonight and why that's important. But this is no ordinary book, and it is all about the finished work of Jesus Christ. The Old Testament was anticipating Jesus Christ. The New Testament, we see him being proclaimed in the Gospels. We see what he did in the Gospels, and then we see him, the church being built based on what he's done in Acts, and then he's explained in the epistles, and then he will show up. We're waiting for him in the book of Revelation. So it is an amazing book. It is God-breathed. Hebrews says it is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword. God's Spirit wrote this, and his Spirit is in us. And as we read this and spend time with us, we know God through his word. If you're a believer and you want to try to know God better and build a relationship with God, you cannot do it apart from his word. God has chosen to reveal himself all the ways he could have done that in the world, God chose to reveal himself in a book. And if you want to know who God is, we know him by his word. Yes, we know him by worship songs. Yes, we know him through other things. But all of those songs and all of those other things are based on how he's revealed himself in his word. You cannot spend time with God apart from spending time in his word in some form. Either if that song's based on his word, this is how he's chosen to reveal himself. And this is where we meet him. If you don't meet him here, then you don't meet him. And it's a difficult book to interpret, if we're being honest, because there's so many different genres and rules and all these kind of things. So let's walk through it. First, here's some good general rules of interpretation. Number one is you need to look for the literal meaning. It was Calvin that said most of the time the meaning that is simple is the meaning that it meant. Because there's not a lot of crazy, symbolic, secretive meaning that you're supposed to dig and find and know outside of the context. The authors were writing these letters and these narratives, these stories to specific people. And they wanted the meaning to be clear. And our goal when we say the literal meaning is you want to know, what did the author who wrote this intend for it to mean? Not what does it mean to you, not what does it mean to your neighbor, and that those two things would be different, but what did the author who wrote this letter intend for it to mean? And what did he intend for the original hearers to hear? And that's important. So when you jump into a passage, you should probably look at the overall goal of the book. Who wrote the book? Why did they write it? And read a few paragraphs before your verse and read a few paragraphs after. It will help you gather the whole meaning of what the author is trying to say. So what did it mean to the author? What did it mean to the hearers? Another one that we should pay attention to is translation and grammatical structure. So many times when you hear someone preach, they often go back to the original language. They go to the Hebrew word or the Greek word because you lose some meaning in the change of languages. The Greek language, for example, is so much more expressive than the English language. So much more expressive. You can communicate a lot of different things with very little words in the Greek than you can with the English. So that's why when you hear us teaching, often we cite some of the Greek words because the verbs in Greek can communicate so much more than English verbs. In English, we only speak in past, present, and future. Greek has like 7 different tenses, and there's a continuous action in the past and just a completed action in the past. And then there's the perfect tense, which is a completed action in the past that has ongoing effects. And one word can communicate either of those 3 things. And that's just the past tense. There's 3 of those. And then you have 2 in the present, and then you have 2 in the future, like all these different things. So that's why it's important for us to go back to the original language when we can. Doesn't mean you have to do it all the time. No, some of the passages are pretty clear cut and pretty close to the Greek that you don't have to, but it helps to get that perspective. Also, we need to look at the historical context. What was going on when this letter, whatever letter or verse that you're reading was written, what was going on in that day? What was going on in the geographical area that it was written in? What was going on in Greek culture or Hebrew culture in those days? What was God doing in the world as the author was writing that particular verse or letter or narrative? Cultural context is important. There's a huge difference between Hebrew culture, as Randy has talked about multiple times, than American culture. There's a huge difference between Greek culture and Hebrew culture. There's a big difference between Greek culture and our culture. For example, we don't live according to the Hebrew culture today in that we don't give our firstborn more inheritance and more status and more significance than any other of our kids. That was a thing that was very specific to Hebrew culture, where if you were the firstborn child, it was highly significant. And you got more inheritance, you got double portion of the inheritance, the family blessing was on you. We treat all of our kids equally. It's just a different culture. And there are some other things like that in the Hebrew culture and the Greek culture that are really important that we need to pay attention to. Another one, which I've alluded to and mentioned, that's probably my favorite, is genre. Just like the music you listen to has different genres, you have to pay attention to the genre of the book that you're reading. The Bible has books that are prophetic, that speak to the future, that are these people speaking on behalf of God. We have books that are narrative, and we see that in the Gospels where it's telling a story of what Jesus did, and here's where he went, and here's what he said, and then he said to him, and then he responded with this, and it's a narrative. We have genres that are epistle, whereas Paul is writing a letter making an argument based on what Jesus has done. Hey, here's how I want you to live. Here's what he's done for you on the cross, and here's the implications of that. And you see Paul make an argument. Here's why the gospel is not just for the Jews, it's for the Gentiles. Here's how we are under grace and no longer under the law. And Paul makes these different arguments, and we, as we read letters like Romans and Galatians and Ephesians, we need to trace the argument that Paul is making over time. And that's why it's important. There's a genre of apocalyptic literature. This is the book of Revelation. There's some apocalyptic literature in Daniel and some other books in the Old Testament, but this is highly symbolic. That as you pick up the book of Revelation, and you're bold if you walk through it and try to read with no help or no guide. Actually, I would even probably say you're foolish to try to walk through it without any kind of outside resources or help. Or community or mentors, because the book of Revelation is highly symbolic. And as we read it, we should pay attention to that and not assume and take everything that we read in Revelation literally, because there's a lot of symbolism there, and that's the nature of the genre of apocalyptic literature. There's figures of speech in here. For example, the Old Testament says the eyes of the Lord run to and fro, looking out. And what he's writing here is not that there's literally God's eyes are just like roaming through the earth, like literally, like figurative, like literal eyes just like flying through the earth. That's not what he's saying. It's a figure of speech that our God sees all, that he's over it all, that he's sovereign over it all, that he's seen the beginning from the end. And to say that his eyes are roaming throughout the earth just means that he sees it. Nothing happens without God seeing it. Nothing sneaks by him that he didn't see. God sees it all. God knows it all. God, he planned it all. He's sovereign over it all. He purposed it all. He decreed it all. And nothing happens that God has not seen, that God is not aware of. So that's a few, and there's so much more. Progressive revelation is important to know, especially as you read the Old Testament, that God was revealing things over time, that all throughout the covenants of the Old Testament, that God was revealing different pieces of what his kingdom would look like to these different people in the Old Testament. So we see in Genesis 12 that God tells Abraham that he's going to bless many nations. And Abraham's so confused. What's that going to look like? I'm really old. I don't even have a kid. And God tells him that through him, he will be a blessing. He will bless Abraham, and Abraham will be a blessing. And through Abraham's lineage, he will bless all the nations. So that's about all the news Abraham gets. And then God gives him some more of the covenant over time. He changes his name to Israel. No, that's Jacob. Never mind. I'm losing track here. But the important thing is so God gives Abraham some of the covenant, and then as you move on, you get to Moses, and God reveals more of the covenant. That this would be a people that are holy unto God, that are distinct, that are set apart. And how are they going to do that? He gives them the law. And then we move on to David, and same covenant, same chosen people that God is making this covenant with. And God tells David that in this group of people there would be a king, and that this king would reign forever. Who's he talking about? He's talking about Jesus. But over time, God is revealing these different pieces of his plan for humanity and how he would redeem it back to himself. And he's doing that progressively. And that's important to know. We talked about the unity of the Bible, that the Bible communicates one overall story. And it's God's work of redemption, God's work to redeem humanity through his son Jesus. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that before we release you guys to do some passages. And then lastly, I want to talk about prophecy for a second. Prophecy is unique in the Bible. And I just gave you an example when God spoke to David and said that his son would be king and that his lineage, his seed, would be on the throne forever. Prophecy in the Old Testament, theologians use the terms that a prophetic word in the Old Testament, it foretells something and it forthtells something. And you may be like, what in the world does that mean? It foretells something and it forthtells something. So Old Testament prophecy, it has a near fulfillment and then it has a far fulfillment. And not all of them, a lot of them are just pretty near fulfillments. But there are prophecies in the Old Testament that foretell and then they forthtell. And just like the one I just told you, there's a near fulfillment and a far fulfillment. So when God comes to David and tells him that his son would be on the throne, the near fulfillment of that means that Solomon, David's literal son, would be king, that he would be on the throne. And the forthtelling, the far fulfillment, is that David would have a descendant who would be on the throne, Jesus. And his kingdom would reign forever. That's what I'm talking about here. Another prophecy that we mess up so many times that I want to talk about is Jeremiah 29:11. We throw this verse to everyone around us and tell them that God has a plan on this earth circumstantially to give them good circumstances and blessing and to not harm them. And we set people up for disappointment when they experience trials and struggles. If you think about it, how do we reconcile Jeremiah 29:11, where God says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you a hope and a future"? How do we reconcile that with the New Testament that says all who desire to live a godly life will be persecuted? Like, how do those two go together? It's because we've misinterpreted Jeremiah 29:11. If you look at the context of Jeremiah 29, God's chosen people have been attacked. They've been taken into captivity. They've been taken into exile into Babylon. So God raised up Jeremiah to prophesy, to speak on his behalf and tell the people that one day God has a literal plan for them, foretelling, the near fulfillment. He was foretelling and forthtelling that God has a plan for them in the near future to prosper them and not to harm them, to give them a hope and a future. Jeremiah was telling them that they weren't going to be in captivity forever. And we see through Ezra and through others that God works and allows his people to come back. He allows them to be set free. And they come back to Israel. And that prophecy was fulfilled. That's the near fulfillment. That this guy named Jeremiah was literally telling the nation of Israel, hey, God has a plan for us and we're not going to be in captivity forever. That's the near fulfillment. The far fulfillment is that God was telling us that he has a plan to prosper us. And what was that plan? It's not to give you awesome earthly circumstances. God's plan to prosper us and not to harm us, to give us a hope and a future, was Jesus. That's what it's talking about. It was pointing to Jesus Christ. It's not pointing for you to get a promotion. It's not pointing to our lives getting better. Like, imagine going to North Korea and preaching this verse that I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, to give you a hope and a future. How could we in good conscience go and tell folks like that live a radically different life than we do, that have so much oppression from the government, so much of their rights taken? How could we go to a group like that and preach this verse and say that it's about their earthly circumstances? Because it's not. God's plan to prosper us and not to harm us, to give us a hope and a future, was his son, Jesus Christ. That's the forthtelling. That's the far fulfillment of this prophecy. And we mess it up so many times. 2 Chronicles 7:14. If you look at the context of Chronicles, what's happening? That Ezra is recounting the law in the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So what happens? In the Old Testament, God's people, God's chosen people. He's freed them from Egypt. He's given them the law. He's asked them to obey him. If you obey me, you'll be my treasured possession. Exodus 19, all these kind of things. Here's what God has done for you. And here's the law. Here's how he wants us to obey. And God's people rebel. They whine. They complain. They don't trust him. They are marching in the book of Numbers, and they get to this place called Kadesh Barnea, and they don't trust God. So what does God do? He punishes the older generation, and he makes them wander in the wilderness until all of them die off. And then he raises up a new leader, Joshua, who's going to lead this younger generation into the promised land. And you've got this guy named Ezra, who's recounting the law to all of their children that are now grown up. All as the older people were wandering in the wilderness and dying off, this younger generation was growing up, and they didn't have the law. So what is Ezra doing? He's giving them the law. He's reminding them of the law in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. He's recounting the law to them, and he's telling them, hey, we have to learn from the mistakes of the older generation. And if God's chosen people, if we will humble themselves, if they will humble themselves, 2nd Chronicles 7:14, who are called by my name, if my people called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. And what happens as you read the Old Testament? They don't do that, and neither will we. We read this verse and we tell it to people like we can all just suddenly turn from our wicked ways. Like all of Christians would just suddenly become humble. What's fascinating about this verse is you never see God's chosen people in the Old Testament obey it. Yet God still hears from heaven and forgives their sin and heals their land. How does he do it? Through Jesus Christ. And that's the grace of God. His people never measure up to this standard. And I hate to say it, and I'm not trying to be a downer, but Christians in America will never meet this standard. But God has still heard from heaven, and he has still forgiven us of our sin. And he did that through his son, Jesus Christ. And that is a guarantee that one day this land will be healed when he returns for his chosen people. And he brings us into the new heaven and the new earth, all those kind of things. So, a few points about the Old Testament, and then we're done. We're giving you some passages to walk through. The Old Testament is all about God's redemptive work. It is all about God. It is not about us. So as we read this Old Testament, and I would encourage you, as you listen to preachers preach from the Old Testament, if the person or the preacher that you're listening to in the Old Testament, if all they're talking about is you, and they're not talking about God, it is a good sign that they are doing what we like to call narcigesis, where they're reading the Bible and they're inserting themselves in the story. We are not characters in the Old Testament. We should not insert ourselves in every story. Every hero of the Old Testament is not supposed to be you and I. We are not the Old Testament heroes, and what happened to them is not a guarantee that it will happen to us. Now, we can learn from people's example. We can learn from their sin especially. We can learn from the brokenness of guys like Abraham and David. We can learn from their mistakes. We can learn from their heart that wants to please God. We can learn that David was a man after God's own heart, and we can model our lives after that. But we cannot read things that happened to David and assume they will happen to us. David was literally in the lineage of Jesus. God made a promise in Genesis 3 that he would send a seed of the woman who would crush the head of the serpent. And part of that seed was Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the way down to David and Solomon, all the way down to Jesus. And why was David able to kill Goliath? Because God made a promise in Genesis 3:15 that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. So how did God protect the seed? He made them into a nation. He chose Abraham, that through his seed, he went from Adam and Eve to Noah to Abraham, and through Abraham that he would develop a nation. Why? So God could protect this promised seed, this seed of the woman. How are they going to protect themselves if they can't defend themselves? He makes them into a nation, and he tells this nation to be holy unto him. And as they live and as he protects them, he gives them land to dwell in, and they have to go in and conquer the land. He gives them a law that they would obey him and live holy unto him. And you see David. He's standing in front of Goliath, and if David were to die, God would be a liar, because God promised that the seed of the woman would ultimately crush the head of the serpent. Why was David able to kill Goliath? Because God had anointed him to be king of Israel, because David was in the lineage of Jesus. You and I aren't in the lineage of Jesus. It's not a guarantee that we can just go out and overcome and slay our giants. We can't, especially the giant of sin. Someone had to slay that giant for us. Look, reading David and Goliath, we should not insert ourselves and say, yeah, if David did that, I can do that. If Moses did X, Y, and Z, then I can do X, Y. I can raise up a stick and part water. We can't do any of that stuff. And we shouldn't assume that everything that happened to our Old Testament heroes is going to happen to us. That's narcissistic. That's narcissism. We shouldn't do that. We should learn from their example. We should learn from their sin. We should learn from their affection and their heart and their pursuit of the Lord. But we should not equate what happened to them with what should happen to us. So it's always about God. It's not about us. The main idea of a passage, as you're reading through an Old Testament passage, the main idea of a passage will almost always tell us something about God. It will almost always tell us something about God. And we form our application or our response from what it tells us about God. So as you read through the Old Testament, look at the activity of God. Look at the words of God. Look at how God responds to his people. It always points to Jesus. Every passage in the Old Testament either sets the stage for Jesus or it anticipates Jesus. And we should always look for, how is this setting the stage for Jesus, or how is this anticipating Jesus coming one day? Because the Old Testament was all about looking forward to this Messiah, this seed of the woman. Starts all the way in Genesis 3. Who is this seed? Who is going to be this descendant of the woman who would ultimately redeem humanity and crush the head of the serpent? That's what we're moving towards throughout the Old Testament. So we should say, what does this say about God? We should form our application or our response based on what it says about God. And we should look, how does this set the scene, or it begs the need for Jesus? Or how does it anticipate Jesus? And then we should ask, how does this connect to the overall storyline of the Bible? And we've walked through the story of the Bible before, and I think we need to do that again just to give you guys some handles on the storyline of the Old Testament, because if you have that, it really helps as you read through this. But those are some tips, and I know we've given you a lot, so what we're going to do is stop right here. We're going to give you some passages to walk through together and to interpret, to develop an interpretation with a group. We're going to give you some time to discuss as well. But that's just a start. We hope these, we call them hermeneutical tools or interpretation tools. We hope they're helpful. You can see that there's a lot of tools. So we shouldn't approach this flippantly. We should approach the scriptures with great care and great caution and great study and great effort. It's not one of these where you close your eyes and point and think that God's going to speak to you. These are letters written to specific people in specific contexts, and we need to know the context so we can know what God meant, what the original author meant, what this verse means when it was written. So there's a lot there. We threw it at you real quick, but we hope that this preps us for Jonah next week as we put some of these tools to practice, and we hope that it helps you in your own Bible reading. So we love you guys, and we hope you enjoy your discussion.